So we are going to go over on how to solve equations that have more than one x term. So far I showed you how to solve if you have how to solve an equation like this where you have only one x term, or how to solve an equation like this or like this where you have only one x term. But now we have equations that have more than one x term. So if you notice, every equation here has more than one x term, one, and then two x terms. Here I have two x terms. So all these equations here, or this one has three x terms. So we are going to go over equations that have more than one x terms. And for this kind of equations, you always make sure that one side is 0. So you must have 0 on one side. Like here, you have a 0. But in this problem, you don't have a 0. Here, you don't have a 0. And this one doesn't have a 0. And this one is good, and this one is good. But there are a couple of equations that do not have a 0. So you have to have, if you have more than one x term, you must have 0 on one side. So this one is already does have its 0. Then I say, how do I factor this problem? Well, both terms have a common factor of x. I have 3x minus x squared is x and x. I look for the common factor, which is x. If I factor the x, I get 3 minus 5x. Then I set each factor, which is x, equal to 0. And then I set my other factor, which is 3 minus 5x, equal to 0. And then I solve each equation. So the steps are 0 on one side, factor the other side, then set each factor equal to 0. X equal to 0 is already done for me. How do I solve this one? I want to isolate the x. I see that I have a 3 here. I want to get rid of that 3. Then I want to get rid of the negative 5. This is a positive 3. I subtract 3 from both sides. So this is gone. 3 minus 3 is 0. 0 minus 3 is negative 3. I get rid of the negative 5. I divide by negative 5. Negative divided by negative is positive. I get 3/5. So the solution is 0 and 3/5. 0 and 3/5. Then I go to the next problem. I see I have an x term on one side, x term on the other side. So I have more than one x term, even though each x is on one side, I still see that I have two x terms. And not only that, sometimes if they have the same degrees, then you move everything to one side, and when you combine like terms, then you will end up with one x term. But right now, even if I move 4x to the other side, because I want to have a 0 on one side, I get 8x to the power 2 minus 4x. So I have two x terms. They don't have the same degree. I can't combine them. So I need to solve this equation. I have to factor, and to factor, I see that I have a 4 here, and I see that 8 can be written as 4 times 2. I have x to the power 2, which is x and x. I look for the common factor, which is x and 4. So 4x is the common factor. I write the common factor here, open up the parentheses, I write the leftovers. The leftover is 2x. And don't think when you factor the 4x out, you're left with nothing here. You're left with 1 here, because you could think of 4 as 4 times 1 times x. If you put 4x, then you're left with 1. So when you factor the entire thing, you're left with 1. Then you set each factor equal to 0. 4x equal to 0, or 2x minus 1 equal to 0. To solve the first equation, you want to isolate for x, divide by 4. 0 divided by 4 is 0. That's one of your solutions. For this one, you add 1 first, because you want to isolate your x, get rid of the number being added or subtracted. Then divide by 2. You get x is half. So the solution to this equation is 0 and half. We want to solve this one. We already have a 0 here, but we have 2x terms, but we can factor this one like the above problems because we have trinomial. And for trinomial factoring, we look for 2 numbers to multiply to give us positive 4, but when we add, we get negative 5. So multiply to get positive and add to get negative. That tells me the factors must be negative. Negative times negative is positive. Negative 1 times negative 4 is positive 4. If I add negative 1 and negative 4, I do get negative 5. So those are my factors. Open up the 2 parentheses with x inside each parentheses. You have a 0 here. X squared is x and x. Put negative 1 inside one parentheses and negative 4 inside the other. Then set each parentheses, each factor equal to 0, and solve. Add 1 to both sides, you get x is 1. Add 4 to both sides, you get x is 4. So the solution to this problem is 1, 4. Let's solve this one. We have a 35 that we need to get rid of. Subtract 35 from both sides. We get 0. So again, we have a trinomial. And we do have our 0 here. So you must have 0 when you're solving equations that have more than one x term. And this is a trinomial. We are going to look for 2 numbers to multiply to give us negative 35 and add to get positive 2. To get a negative factor, one factor must be, to get a negative number, one factor must be negative, one factor must be positive. So we have negative 7 and positive 5, or rather positive 7 and negative 5. Those are the factors, because 7 times negative 5 is negative 35, and 7 plus minus 5 or 7 minus 5 is positive 2. We want to have positive 2 and negative 35. So 7 and negative 5 are the factors. We put positive 7 in one parenthesis, negative 5 in the other. And then we set each factor equal to 0. We get x plus 7 equal to 0, or x minus 5 equal to 0. To solve the first one, we subtract 7 from both sides. We get x is negative 7. To solve the other one, we add 5. We get x is 5. So the solution is -7 and +5. Let's solve this one for this equation. Again, this is not 0. We subtract 8 from both sides to get our 0. We have 2x terms, so we get 3x to the power 2 plus 2x minus 8. We want to multiply two numbers to get -8 and add to get +2. So the numbers are 4 and -2. 4 times -2 is -8. 4 plus -2 is +2. If I add the numbers, I get the +2. If I multiply them, I get -8. Oh, sorry. I'm making a mistake. Big mistake. Sorry about that. So anyways, let's retract. We subtract 8. We get 0 on one side. I noticed that I can't factor like that because this number is a 3. I cut my own mistake. I wasn't paying attention that this number is not 1. I could use that type of factoring, look for two numbers to get -8 and add to get +2 if this number was a 1, but I have a 3 here. So what I do is multiply 3 by 8. 3 by 8, I get 24. I change 8 to 24. I leave +2x alone, and I change this 3 to 1. So when the coefficient of x to the power 2 is not 1, you multiply that coefficient by the last number, the constant. You change 8 to the new number, and you change 3 to 1, and then you factor. You say, what are the factors for 24? The factors for -24 are 6 and -4. Because if I multiply 6 by -4, I get -24. And if I add them, I end up subtracting 4 from 6. 6 take away 4 is +2. So 6 and -4 are the correct factors. Then you write it as x and x. You put a +6 and a -4. And we are not done yet because now we have to remember to divide each factor by this 3 here. We reduce. 6 and 3 are reduced. We get x plus 2. But 4 and 3 cannot be reduced. 3 goes here. We get 3x minus 4 is equal to 0. So I was able to factor this and write it as x plus 2 times 3x minus 4. Now I set each factor, x plus 2 equal to 0, and solve. I get x is -2. That's one of the answers. And then I set 3x minus 4 equal to 0. I add a 4 to both sides. I get 3x is equal to 4. Divide both sides by 3. I get x is 4/3. So the solution to this problem is -2 and +4/3. How do I factor this problem? For this problem, I do have the characteristic that we look for, that is, this is a 4, this is a 2, 2 is half of 4. I also, I can factor it using trinomial factoring, but then the coefficient here is 4. So what do I do with that 4? I multiply 4 by 9. I get 36. I'm going to replace 9 by 36. and then I leave everything else alone here, and I change this 4 to 1. Then I look for two numbers to multiply to get 36, and the numbers are, to get 36, I want to get positive 36, and when I add, I want to get negative 37. So because this number is negative, the factors must be negative, because negative times negative gives me positive, and when I add two negative numbers, I get negative. So negative 1 times negative 36 is positive 36, and negative 1 times plus negative 36 is positive negative 37. So these are my factors. But remember what to do for your x's. You write your x to the power 4 as x squared and x squared. When this is x squared, you open up your parentheses and you just put x and x. But when this is degree of 4, you break x to the power 4 and write it as x squared times x squared. Then one factor is negative 1. One factor is negative 36. Don't forget, this problem was this type. You have a coefficient of 4, so you have to divide each factor by 4. 1/4, 4 is not reduced, so just move it to make it the coefficient of x to the power 2. But 36 and 4 are reduced to 9 and 1, so the first parentheses becomes 4x to the power 2 minus 1. But the second parenthesis is just going to be x squared minus. Because this 4 is reduced, you move 1 over, you just get 1x squared. And now these are your factors. You set it equal to 0. I'm going to need a little bit room here. So I write this x to the power 4 minus 64 x squared here for later. So you set each factor equal to 0. How do we solve these kind of equations? We are just going to add a 1 to both sides. Because we have only one x term, and when we have only one x term, we isolate it. So I add 1 to both sides, and then divide both sides by 4. Now I want to get rid of that 2. I put a square root here and a square root here. The side that has a number, you put a positive and a negative. 2 and x, the square root cancel each other, you get x. A square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 4 is 2. Or a square root of 1/4 is 1/2. So you get positive and negative 1/2. How do I solve this one? I only have one x term. I add 9 to both sides. I isolate it. Then I'm going to square root both sides. But the side that has a number gets positive and negative. The square root of x squared is x, but the square root of 9 is 3. So the solution is positive, negative 1/2, positive, negative 3. These are all your solutions. You could also write it as negative 1/2, negative 3, positive 3, positive 1/2. You can write them like that too. So let me solve this one first, and then we go over the other. We look for the common factor here. Both of these have x to the power 2 in common, if you notice. This one has 4 x's. I didn't break 64 because 64 is, I don't have a number here for me to write 64 as a bunch of factors. The common factor is x to the power 2. The leftovers are also x to the power 2 minus 64. I set each factor equal to 0 because I only have one x term. I don't need to factor them anymore. To solve this one, you square root both sides. You put a radical over each side. The side that is a number, you put positive, negative. The square root of 0 is 0. You get positive, negative, 0. But positive, negative, 0 is just 0. That's one solution. And then the other one, you add a 64 to isolate your x. You get x squared is 64. You put a radical and a radical with positive, negative on the number side. So the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 64 is 8. Positive, negative 8. So your solution to this problem is 0, negative 8, positive 8. Lastly, I have a problem that is has 4 terms. And if you remember, when we have 4 terms, we need to do group factoring. And for this problem, I'm going to go to another. I'm going to open up another screen because this screen just has too much data, so it's freezing. So I have x to the power 3 minus x to the power 2 x to the power 3 minus x to the power 2 minus 4x minus 4 equal to 0. That's what we have. We have more than one x term, we have 0. And these are the things you test. You say, do I have more than one x term? And do I have a 0 on the other side? If that is the case, then you say, what type of factoring I have to do? For this problem, we are going to do group factoring because we have 4 terms. We pair up the first two, the last two. We look for the common factor for the first two, which the common factor for the first two is x to the power 2 because they both have that in common. The leftovers go inside the parentheses. When entire thing is factored out, you're left with 1. Remember, you have a 1. Then you go and look for the common factor between these two. They both have a common factor of negative 4. So when I factor the negative 4 from these two, I'm left with leftovers, which is x. And when you factor the entire thing, you're left with 1. Right? When you factor negative 4, you're left with positive 1 here. So maybe this, in order for this to work, this has to be a plus. Sorry about that, guys. When I copied it, either I made a mistake there or I made a mistake here. So I want to make a problem so that these two parentheses are identical. So this must be a plus here. So anyways, I factor the -4. When I factor this -4, I'm left with +1. Because -4 times x gives me -4x, and -4 times 1 gives me -4. So always check your work to make sure you haven't made a mistake in your signs. When I get to this point, I look for a common factor one more time, and I see that both have these parentheses as their common factor. X plus 1 is a common factor. I put the common factor, I open up the parentheses, I drop the leftovers. And then I say x plus 1 is equal to 0. X squared minus 4 is equal to 0. Subtract 1, you get x is -1. You add 4, you get x squared is +4. You square root both sides. The side that has a number gets a positive and a negative. So you get x is equal to +2. So your numbers are -1, -2, +2. These are your factors. I want to go over one more problem here. For this problem, we try to factor, right? Because we have a trinomial. We want to look for factors of 6, -6. So when I add them, I get -4. -1 times 6 is -6, but when I add them, I get +5. How about +1 and -6? If I multiply them, I get -6, but when I add them, -6 plus 1 is -5. Then I look at -2 and +3. When I add them, I get +1, and 2 times -3 is also -6, but when I add or subtract them, I get -1. So as you see, I am not getting -4, so this is not factorable. What do I do to solve it? There is a formula that is called quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula says, if you take the following numbers and put them in the following formula, it is going to give you the answer to x. The number that is next to x to the power 2 I'm going to go over this multiple times, but I just want to explain to you how it goes. So there is a formula that I'm going to give it to you in a moment. But since I cannot factor this problem and I want to solve for x, there is a formula that I use to solve for x. What I do is the number that is next to your x, this number -4, you're going to put it here. And there is a negative in the formula here. So let me use a different color here. So that number next to your x is going to go here. And that number is -4. And also it's going to go in here. So this -4 goes here and here. Then the number that is next to your x to the power 2, which in this case, the number next to x to the power 2 is 1. This number 1 is going to go to here. Oops. It's going to go here and, sorry, here. And this should be multiplied like that. So, -4 is next to x. You have to put it inside this parentheses and in here, in this parentheses. +1 that is next to x to the power 2 goes in this parentheses and in this parentheses. And at last, the number that is here, -6, goes here. And then you are going to simplify this expression. Negative times negative is positive. -4 to the power 2 is +16. You have a 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times -6 is -24. And negative turns into an addition. And 2 times 1 is 2. Negative and negative turns that into an addition. 16 plus 24 is 40. And then you write 40 as 2 times 2 times 2 times 5, because 40 is made out of 4 and 10, and 4 is 2 and 2, and 10 is 2 and 5. So then you write your 40 as 2 times 2 times 2 times 5. Let me just write 40 here. And anytime you have a double, it comes out as a single. And 2 times 5 is 10. So your answer to square root of 40 is 2 square root of 10. So let me just change that to 2 square root of 10. And then I will write x is equal to 4 plus 2 square root of 10 divided by 2. And then you have a minus. X is equal to 4 minus 2 square root of 10 divided by 2. To get the exact answer, to get an estimate of your answer, put a square root of 10 in the calculator, multiply it by 2, add it to 4 divided by 2. And again, put a square root of 10 in the calculator, multiply it by 2, subtract it from 4 divided by 2. So I'm just going to figure out what we would get if I find the square root of 10 to find an estimation of the answer. And square root of 10 is 3.1622. I'm just going to take it as 3.16. I write a square root of 10 is about 3.16. So it goes as 4 plus 2 times 3.16 divided by 2. So I multiply those two first. I get 4 plus 6.32 divided by 2. So I add it to 4. I add these two, I get 10.32. Then I divide it by 2. These are your x. And I get x is 5.16, about. I do the same thing for this one. I already know a square root of 10 is 3.16. I multiply it by 2. And then I subtract this from 4 and then divide it by 2. So this gives me x is equal to 4 minus is about, sorry. So I get 4 minus 2 times 3.16. 4 minus 6.32. When I subtract these two, I get negative 2.32 divided by 2, which is negative 1.6, and that is about. So I have these two answers. And sometimes they want you to find the answer like that without reducing, without estimating it. And when they want you to do that, you have to remember this 4 is being divided, this 2, 4 is being divided by 2, and then this other term is being divided by 2. So if that is the case, you say 4 is being divided 2 by 2 plus minus 2 square root of 10 is being divided by 2. And then you are going to reduce each fraction. You go 4 divided by 2 is 2. These 2's are reduced, you get a square root of 10. This is called the exact answer, and these two are called the estimation. So this is an estimation, and this is the exact. So let's do one more. Quadratic equation. So when you cannot factor, you have to use quadratic formula. And what is the quadratic formula? It says, if you have this kind of equations, whether you can factor them or not, you can always use the quadratic formula. So any equation that is in this form, you can use quadratic formula to solve it. So there's a 2 here. This is an x, and this is a constant c. And the quadratic formula, which gives you the solution to x, is x equals to minus b plus minus square root of b to the power 2 minus 4 times a times c divided by 2 times a. So this is your b, this is your a, and this is your c. So again, if I have, let's say, x to the power 2 plus 2x minus 5 equal to 0, then a is, this is my c, minus 5. Then this is my a is 1. And then this is my b. And the quadratic formula says, I usually do this. I just put negative, I put this in front of me, and then I put parentheses plus minus. I put another parenthesis here. I won't put the b in here. I leave a spaces for my new ABC. I just put parentheses, and then I go and find my ABC. So remember, A is 1, this is A. B is 2, so B goes here, positive 2 and positive 2. And C is -5, which goes here, and A, which is 1, goes here. So A is 1, C is -5, I put -5 here, and B was 2, you put a 2 here and 2 here. And then you simplify this. I get -2, positive minus, 2 to the power 2 is 4. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times -5 is -20. So I have a minus 20, which turns it into an addition. Then 4 and 20 is 24. We break 24 as 2 and 12. And 12 is 3 and 4. And 4 is 2 and 2. So 24 is made out of 3, 2, 2, 2. Doubles come out as a single. 3 times 2 is 6. So square root of 24 can be simplified as 2 square root of 6. So I go back here. The square root of 24 is 2 square root of 6. And again, if you want to find the estimation, put a square root of 6 in your calculator and simplify these two inside your calculator. But don't forget to make one of them positive, one of them must be negative. But if they tell you to leave it as is, then you have to remember to reduce it if it's reducible. Again, this 2 and 2, and this 2 and 2, this 2 denominator belongs to both terms on the top. So you reduce them. 2 divided by 2, and 2 square root of 6 also gets divided by 2. So always go through this process to reduce it. Otherwise, it's common students cancel these 2's and then they think they're done, and that is an error. So never do that. Always go through this process of breaking that fraction into 2 fractions. 2 and 2 is reduced, you get -1. 2 and 2 are reduced, you get a square root of 6, and that is your exact answer. But if you want to find an estimation, you need to find the square root of 6 and a square root of 6 is 8 point. I'm just going to call it, sorry about that, I didn't do this correctly. The square root of it is 2.45. I'm going to estimate it as 2.45. So you multiply 2 by 2.45. You get 4.9, so you get -2 plus 4.9 divided by 2. Then you subtract 2 from it, you get 2.9, and then you divide it by 2. So you get x is 1.45. Then you come to this one again, the square root of 6 is 2.45, so when you multiply it by 2, you get 4.9. Both numbers are negative, you end up adding them. You get -6.9 divided by 2, which is -3.45. So that's your other. And these are estimations, so you should use this notation to say it's about. So that's one solution, that's your other solution, or you can write both solution as an exact answer like that. Sometimes they say write it like this. And so forth. So this is how you solve equations.